What if the United States government secretly experimented on its own citizens? What if ordinary people were given powerful drugs without knowing why? And what if fear, confusion, and psychological pressure were treated as research data? This is the story of Project MKUltra, a hidden CIA program built around one terrifying question: can the human mind be controlled? Behind locked doors and classified files, the search had already begun. After World War II, America entered the Cold War. The fear was no longer limited to armies, bombs, or missiles. Officials worried that the next battlefield would not be land or sky. It would be the human mind. Inside smoky intelligence rooms, officials asked a disturbing question. If America's enemies could break a prisoner's mind, should America learn how to do it first? The question sounded like strategy, but behind it were real human beings. Scientists opened their notebooks and began to ask the unthinkable. Could memory be erased? Could loyalty be rewritten? Could fear make someone easier to control? And could a person be turned into a weapon? In 1953, the secret program received its name, MKUltra, on paper. It sounded like another technical government project. But behind that cold official name was a hidden world of experiments, secrecy, and moral danger. Chemists, doctors, psychologists, and intelligence officers became part of the search. Some studied drugs, some studied memory, some studied fear and obedience. Together, they crossed a dangerous line between science and control. One substance fascinated them more than almost any other: LSD. To researchers, it appeared powerful, unpredictable, and dangerous. A small dose could alter perception, bend reality, create panic, and make a person question what was real. Some people may have understood that they were part of research. Others never knew. Behind glass walls and hidden observation rooms, reactions were written down. Fear became data, and people became file numbers. The laboratory was not always a laboratory. Some experiments were connected to apartments, bars, hidden rooms, microphones, and one-way mirrors. In those places, the city itself became part of the experiment, and the subject might never know who was watching. In some cases, the experiment did not look like an experiment at all. It could begin in a dim bar with a drink, a conversation, and someone watching from the shadows. The subject might believe it was an ordinary night, but the room was already under observation. Then the reaction began. The walls seemed different. Time felt strange. Reality changed without warning. To the subject, it was terrifying. To the observers behind the glass, it was something else entirely. It was data. Every reaction was written down. Every symptom became a note. Every moment of confusion became part of a file. Names were hidden. Reports were coded. And the paper trail of MKUltra began to grow in silence. The program did not stay inside intelligence offices. Money moved through grants, foundations, universities, and hospitals. Some researchers may not have known who was truly behind the funding, but the experiments continued, protected by layers of secrecy. Some people entered hospitals looking for treatment. They came with pain, confusion, or fear. They expected care. But in some places, the line between treatment and experimentation became dangerously blurred. A patient could become a subject without ever understanding why. Isolation became one of the most disturbing tools. No clock, no window, no clear sense of time. A person left alone in silence could begin to lose control of thought, memory, and fear. The room itself became pressure. Then came repetition. Voices played again and again. The same words, the same message, the same pressure on the mind. For the subject, it was not treatment. It was an attempt to wear down identity itself. Some experiments moved beyond drugs and isolation. Old medical equipment, clinical rooms, and controlled procedures became part of the program's darker history. The language was scientific. The setting was medical. But the human cost was impossible to ignore. Not everyone was comfortable with what was happening. Some people saw the danger clearly. Where was consent? Where was protection? Where was the line between research and abuse? In MKUltra, that line was crossed again and again. Prisoners became convenient subjects. They were isolated, controlled, and often desperate for relief or advantage. In that environment, consent was never simple. A signature on paper could not erase the pressure behind it. Power shaped every choice. Sometimes participation was presented as an opportunity, a promise of help, a promise of privileges, a promise that life might become easier. But when a person has little power, a choice can become pressure, and pressure can destroy real consent. Subjects were often told one thing while the real purpose stayed hidden. They may have believed they were receiving treatment, therapy, or ordinary research. But behind the explanation was a classified agenda. The truth was not given to them. It was kept from them. Secrecy did not only live in locked rooms, it lived in language. Words were softened, programs were renamed, experiments became studies, control became research, and human suffering was hidden behind official phrases. Inside the intelligence world, knowledge was restricted. Only a small circle needed to understand the full picture. That secrecy gave the program protection. It also gave it power. The fewer people who knew, the easier it became to deny. Not every experiment stayed under control. A subject could panic. A reaction could become unpredictable. The observers might keep writing, but the person in the room was living through terror. For the program, it was a result. For the subject, it was trauma. The damage did not always end when the experiment ended. Some people returned home changed. Families saw fear, confusion, anger, and silence where a familiar person used to be. The files recorded symptoms, but families lived with the aftermath. Even inside the system, doubt could appear. Some researchers must have understood the danger. Science without conscience becomes something else. A notebook may record observations, but it cannot erase responsibility. At some point, knowledge demands a moral choice. National security became the shield. Fear of the enemy justified dangerous ideas. Officials told themselves the work was necessary, but necessity can become an excuse. And when secrecy removes accountability, even a democracy can cross a frightening line. The money did not always move openly. It passed through grants, foundations, and carefully arranged channels. On paper, it looked clean. But behind the funding trail was a hidden sponsor. A signature could hide an agency. A grant could hide an experiment. Behind every file number was a person, a father, a mother, a patient, a prisoner, a citizen. MKUltra was not only a story about secrecy, it was a story about people whose pain was turned into paperwork. For some subjects, the pressure became unbearable. The drugs, the isolation, the repeated procedures, and the confusion left deep marks. A person can survive an experiment and still lose something inside. MKUltra did not simply study the mind, it damaged it. The central question remained, could the CIA truly control a human being? The evidence pointed toward something different. They could confuse, they could frighten, they could break trust and memory, but reliable control over the human mind remained out of reach. When results were unclear, the language of reports became useful. Failure could be described as progress. Damage could be described as observation. Uncertainty could be buried under technical words. The program continued, protected not only by secrecy, but by paperwork. Years later, investigators searched for answers, but many records were missing. Some files had vanished. Some trails ended in empty boxes and locked archives. The truth had not simply been hidden. Parts of it had been destroyed. By the 1960s, America was changing. Protests grew louder. Culture shifted. Trust in authority began to weaken. But behind the visible unrest, secret experiments had already shaped a darker story. The public saw the surface. The files held the shadow. Eventually, the original dream of total mind control began to collapse. The results were unreliable. The risks were growing. The program started to wind down. But ending an operation is not the same as facing what it did. Then came one of the most damaging decisions. Records were ordered destroyed. Reports, names, details, and evidence were removed from history. A paper trail that could have answered victims' questions was shredded before the public could see it. But secrecy is rarely perfect. Some records survived. Financial documents, scattered files, and forgotten references began to reveal what had happened. The whole story was damaged, but not erased. Even fragments could speak. Journalists began asking questions that officials did not want answered. Who funded the experiments? Who approved them? Who were the subjects? And why had so many records disappeared? The story was no longer buried inside government walls. Then came the hearings. Under bright lights and microphones, the secret program was dragged into public view. Senators asked what had been done in the name of national security. For the first time, America had to listen to the truth out loud. Under the lights of the hearing room, officials were forced to answer questions. Who approved the tests? Who knew about the subjects? And how much had been hidden? Every answer seemed careful. Every pause suggested that the full truth was still out of reach. Across America, people listened in disbelief. The program was not a rumor anymore. It was not just a conspiracy whispered in the dark. It was being discussed in public under oath in the halls of government. The shock was real. For the victims, the hearings were not just history, they were personal. Some had spent years trying to understand what had happened to them. Others carried trauma their families could not explain. Their pain had finally found a public voice. Officials often used careful language. Mistakes were made. Procedures failed. Records were incomplete. But those words could not fully describe what people had endured. Behind every official phrase was a human life changed forever. MKUltra forced a question that was bigger than one agency. Can a democracy defend freedom by violating human dignity? Can secrecy protect a nation if it destroys trust? And who decides where national security ends and abuse begins? The hearings revealed a dangerous gap between secrecy and oversight. Intelligence agencies may need secrecy to operate, but secrecy without accountability creates risk. When no one is watching the watchers, power can move beyond the law. Investigators searched through files, but many pages were blacked out. Names were missing, details were removed. Some documents raised more questions than answers. The redactions became part of the story. The silence on the page spoke loudly. Many victims may never be fully known. Some names disappeared into destroyed records. Some lives were reduced to numbers, codes, and fragments. The tragedy of MKUltra is not only what was done, it is how many people may never be counted. Science depends on consent, honesty, and protection. Without those principles, research becomes exploitation. MKUltra showed what can happen when intelligence goals override human rights. The language may be scientific, but the damage is deeply human. The legacy of MKUltra did not end with the hearings. It left behind distrust, unanswered questions, and a warning for the future. When governments operate in darkness, citizens pay the price. And once trust is broken, it is never easily restored. MKUltra became fuel for countless conspiracy theories. But the real facts are disturbing enough. The danger is not only what people imagine. The danger is what the records actually show. A secret program existed, and real people were harmed. They searched for truth serum. They searched for memory control. They searched for a way to break resistance and shape behavior. But what they were really seeking was power over the human mind, a power no government should ever hold without limits. They did not find a reliable way to control the mind, but they found something else. They found how easily a mind could be confused, frightened, and damaged. The search for control became a record of harm. The human mind is not a machine with a simple switch. It cannot be opened, erased, and rewritten like a file. Some victims survived with scars. Some families carried the pain for decades. But the truth, like memory, resisted erasure. By the time the truth came out, many records were gone. For victims seeking justice, missing files meant missing proof. But the absence of evidence did not erase the suffering. Pain does not become imaginary because paperwork was destroyed. MKUltra is not only a story from the past, it is a warning about unchecked power. When fear becomes policy and secrecy replaces oversight, human rights become fragile. The lesson is simple. No agency should operate beyond accountability. The darkest secret was not only that experiments happened. It was that ordinary people became invisible in the name of national security. They were not just subjects, they were citizens. They had names, families, and lives that were never meant to become classified. One surviving page can expose an empire of silence. A single file, a payment record, or a forgotten reference can reopen history. They tried to bury the truth in destroyed records. But even fragments can speak louder than denial. Project MKUltra failed to master the human mind, but it proved something deeply frightening. When secrecy replaces law and fear replaces ethics, citizens can become experiments. The program ended, but the warning remains. So the next time someone says the government would never do that, remember MKUltra? Because the most frightening secrets are not always rumors. Sometimes they are real. Sometimes they are documented. And sometimes they are declassified.